President Muhammadu Buhari on Friday, the 31st of December 2021, signed the 2022 budget into law. The budget titled Budget of Economic Growth and Sustainability into law. The budget was valued at 17.126 trillion naira and was transmitted to the president by the president by the National Assembly on Friday, December 24. A breakdown of the budget includes 869 billion naira for statutory allocation, 3.8 trillion naira for debt servicing, 6.9 trillion naira and 5.4 trillion naira for recurrent and capital expenditure, respectively. The oil benchmark was raised from the proposed $57 per barrel to $62 per barrel, with a projected oil production which was put at 1.8 million barrels per day. Finance, Budget and National Planning Minister, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, says the amount, which represents 3.4% of the gross domestic product, will be financed mainly by borrowings due to the paucity of funds. Well, let's understand key details of the 2022 budget. And joining me now live virtually to do this via Zoom is a senior manager at tax and regulatory at Deloitte, Mr. Nojeem Yusuf. Good afternoon, Mr. Yusuf. It's very good to see you.
Good afternoon, Deloitte. Thank you for having me today.
Yes, let's start with the budget of a deficit of over 6 trillion naira, which is almost 4% of the GDP. Well, this is slightly above the 3% ceiling set by the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007. Do you see why the overwhelming concern goes beyond the January to December cycle rather than accumulating deficit and debt base?
Okay, thanks, Tolu, for that question. Yes, I think it's correct that there are valid concerns around Nigeria's debt profile, but it's important to put the issues in the right context. You realize, like you have said, the Fiscal Responsibility Act requires that the deficit to GDP ratio does not go beyond 3%. But again, there's an additional provision in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that enables the president to exceed the 3% threshold when certain occurrences occur. So, for example, if you're in the incidence of a pandemic or a part of the country is war-torn or there's general breakdown of law and order, there will be scope for the president to exceed that threshold. Because in reality, when these incidences occur, there's generally a requirement for additional funding to be able to curtail these occurrences. And I mean, and that's exactly what has happened. And if you realize, from year 2020, which was when we had the incidence of COVID-19, that was the first time that when Nigeria exceeded the 3% threshold in a very long time. And it was an alignment of the provision of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And we're not alone in that. If you compare ourselves with the kind of countries we like to compare ourselves with, you appreciate that many of these other countries had increased deficit to GDP ratio upon the incidence of COVID-19. We are just about 4%. I mean, neighboring Ghana is doing about 9%. South Africa is doing about 12%. The UK and US are doing between 11 and 15% deficit to GDP ratio. So looking at that ratio itself, it's exactly not a problem, to be honest. The only concern is that it has only is slightly above the threshold set by the Responsibility Act. But again, there's provision within the Act that enables the president to go above that threshold in circumstances that I mentioned slightly earlier. So, I mean, it's a concern, yes, but it's not so much to worry about. There are other concerns to worry about beyond the deficit to GDP ratio. There are concerns around whether our debt service to revenue ratio is efficient enough. But from a deficit to GDP ratio perspective, that's not so much of a problem. And because it appears as though the president has acted in line with the provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because those ratios has been increased based on occurrences that have been permitted by the Responsibility Act.
Beautiful. But the president has also noted so far that expenditure level is necessary to assist with overcoming current security challenges and accelerate post-recession growth. Well, the president, and not only him, has insisted that Nigeria only has a revenue challenge and not a debt sustainability problem. So the public stance totally differs from government's body language. Do you think there will be a shift or shifting in stance on either parties as we move on?
Okay, at some point, I expect that parties will shift their stand when they begin to get quality information. I think the reason why the government and the people have different stands is because the quality of information available to many people is not adequate. because this is a factual. Whether we have a debt sustainability problem or we have a revenue problem, it's a matter of fact. The numbers don't lie; they speak for themselves. And we need to look at what the stories, the numbers are telling. And I'll give you a particular instance. For example, we got a 35% debt to GDP ratio. That's an extremely sustainable rate. I mean, if you compare ourselves with our peers, ourselves with emerging economies, we're not doing badly at 35%. What that number suggests is that we actually even have capacity to borrow a bit more. So from a sustainability perspective, I want to talk about sustainability. We're talking about the capacity of the economy to afford to borrow more, the capacity of the economy to borrow and to repay debts without being distressed. That's what sustainability is about. And Nigeria does not have a sustainability problem. For example, IMF have come up with a list of countries that have issues, that have debt distress problem. They have problems paying their debts. They have significant issues being able to pay their debts. Nigeria is clearly not one of those countries. Nigeria is not close to being one of those countries. So we do not have a problem to be able to borrow a bit more money to fund our infrastructure needs. The problem that we have is that we're actually not generating enough revenue to be able to support our budget. I mean, for example, last year, I mean, based on the numbers that have been released as at November 2021, we've got about 76% debt service to revenue ratio. What that means is that for every $100 Nigeria earns, $76 goes into paying debt. That's not exactly good enough. But with the kind of GDP that we have, what it suggests is that we have the potential to grow our revenue. And once you grow that revenue, what it means is that we're able to then gradually reduce the service to revenue ratio. Because when I read on the pages of the newspaper, a lot of people say that we have too much debt. The answer is that not borrowing is not going to solve any problem. Not borrowing will mean that yes, we're going to have a reduced debt service to revenue ratio. But what it also means is that we're not going to have enough fund to be able to provide the kind of infrastructure that Nigerians are demanding. I mean, recently, I think last year, there was a point where the president came up to say that we need about 1.5 trillion USD to be able to provide the infrastructure needs of Nigeria. That is clearly not going to come from revenue, at least in the short term. We need to grow that revenue gradually, but up until when we're able to generate the kind of revenue that we actually need, we will need to be continuing to borrow to be able to fix the infrastructure needs. I think the bigger issue should go to around appropriation of budget properly, so that when you have decided to put some 10 trillion naira for capex and opex, those amounts are spent correctly. There's efficiency in spending the funds that are being borrowed. I do not think the problem is actually borrowing. I think the problem is around borrowing right and ensuring that you're borrowing from a large perspective for capex, and that there's efficiency in implementing what you've been budgeting for. So it's not that it shouldn't be a case of borrowing and there are high incidences of corruption in the land. That's largely what I think the public has an issue with. So I don't think it's right for the public to demand that the government stops borrowing or reduce borrowing. We actually are probably not even borrowing enough. What we need to do is to grow that revenue to be able to have a decent debt service to revenue ratio, and also manage our costs to minimize the cost of governance.
All right. Hold your thoughts there, Nojeem, for 1 minute. Just 1 minute, we'll continue our discussion. We are going to be taking some live pictures now from the 52nd Convocation University of Lagos. We'll have live pictures from there as we take you through proceedings there here in Lagos. We'll continue on the other side with the program, so stay with us on TVC News.
Sometimes allowed, that why similar arrangements have not been recreated in our environment. If it's good for Stanford, it's good for the University of Lagos. We can all easily agree that many universities in the country, private and public, would benefit significantly from such close contact with private sector energy, practice, and resources.
All right there. Now, Nojeem, you were trying to make a point before I interjected. Can you just wrap up on that so that we move on with the discussion?
So I was generally saying that when the public talks about increased borrowing, it's important for government to be able to educate the public why those borrowings are necessary. And like I said earlier, like the president said a year ago or maybe 2 years ago, that said that we needed about $1.5 trillion to provide to fix our infrastructure needs. That is certainly not going to come solely from revenue. We currently do not have that short-term capacity to generate that kind of revenue. So it means that we need to borrow. And like I said before, I think what is key for Nigerians is that when we borrow, Nigerians want to be able to see the results of what you borrowed for. Want to see that you have provided this road infrastructure, this train here, and public health facilities, and what have you. But I think it's important for government to also, maybe by way of the National Orientation Agency, to be able to educate Nigerians on why these borrowings are necessary. They're able to demonstrate to Nigerians whether or not they spent these funds judiciously. Because if you don't put that there, what happens is that a lot of people, because there's a lot of people in the media providing all sort of information out that say the borrowing is too large, Yes, it is large, but we need to provide it in record. So we need this borrowing to get where we want to need. All we need to do is to ensure that we have utilized those funds as judiciously as possible.
All right, now the deficit is also expected to be financed by new borrowings, privatization proceeds, and drawdown on loans secured for specific projects. The non-debt recurrent expenditure is 6.83 trillion naira, with the largest expense item, with 60% relating to personnel costs at 4.1 trillion naira. How do we begin to slim down the cost of governance? It's really important. That's the approach mimicked by global economies today. What do you make of this?
Okay, so the first thing I also need to say is that even though personnel costs make up the bulk of our recurrent expenditure, it's important to emphasize that that cost alone is not cost used to fund, if you like, politicians or public officers. It's a combination of personnel costs for public officers and also civil servants, teachers in secondary school, lecturers in the universities, you got doctors in the hospitals. Also includes pension, if you like, for retired persons. So all this put together is what you have in this bucket. So while there are claims that the cost of governance is significantly high, and I also think that the government has acknowledged it at some point, there's also arguments on the other hand that the salaries paid to civil servants are significantly low compared to their peers in the private sector. So yes, it's important to reduce the cost of governance, but again, it's also important to, they also argument in some other quarters to also raise the cost of maintaining civil servants in their positions. But first thing that comes to mind is the fact that beyond the fact it's important to raise salaries for civil servants. I also think it's key to evaluate the costs that have been incurred. I mean, why pay salaries to two people? Why have two persons in the same position when you can have one person? And some will argue that why do you want to have two houses at the National Assembly when you can have one? Why do you want to have separate quarters for XYZ and the other? So I think the critical thing is to evaluate the costs, the personnel costs altogether, whether it relates to civil service or to public service, and ensure that we're only incurring costs that are necessarily required, and not incur costs for two persons when you can incur costs for one person. Not have two buildings when you can have costs for one person. Not fly to another location when you can actually not fly to another location when you actually have that conversation over Zoom. So it's a case of looking at the makeup of the current expenditure and beginning to identify areas of inefficiencies so that we can have as much efficiency as possible in the cost that they will incur. It's not going to happen in 1 year. It's not going to happen in 2 years. There has to be a plan around it. So gradually reducing those costs without necessarily impacting efficiency. If anything, we want to raise the efficiency in the way we incur our costs, in the way we run the government, because you don't want to reduce costs and also reduce efficiency. You want to be able to reduce costs and at the same time increase the efficiency in the way governance is being managed.
Interesting stuff there. Let's now look at revenue generating initiatives in the budget. Well, some are commendable, but a key focus is to diversify our economy, of course, away from crude. Now, which currently accounts for more than 80% of total foreign exchange receipts. Now, what is government doing wrong in this regard? And how do you see a change in the narrative coming up?
Personally, I think that the easier approach to raise government revenue, that is federal government revenue, is to raise all revenue. So, for example, we currently do about 1.4 million barrels of crude per day. Even much less than that. If you take away the portion that relates to condensate, we do about 1.2 million million barrels per day. OPEC has said that we can do as much as 1.4. So we're not even producing up to the OPEC threshold that has been allocated for. So it means that day in, day out, we are losing value that could have arisen from 200,000 barrels of crude by day. If you wrap up the numbers together throughout the year, that's some significant revenue shortage that we're not making. And this is arising because we've got issues around security in the Niger Delta, because you have a couple of other forms of inefficiencies. The other bit is that Nigeria petroleum industry is one of the most expensive places to do upstream petroleum operations. Even though there's this project that the government is working on, there's this upstream cost optimization project. What that seeks to do is to increase efficiency in that space. What it means is that the profitability of businesses in that area is going to increase. If profitability increase, it means that the government take away from that sector in form of taxes is going to increase. I mean, those are kind of inefficiencies that we think government needs to fix just around the oil industry. I mean, when you do that quick fixes, within a year, you're able to raise significant revenues from oil, because there are significant potentials there. Because looking at the challenge of energy transition in a couple of decades, depending on who is making the forecast, whether it's 20 years, whether it's 30 years or 40 years, at some point, oil is not going to be as valuable as it is now. Maybe it will just be as valuable as coal, which isn't very important in today's world energy. So before that time comes, it's important for government to increase the rate at which we pump crude. Many years ago, the government has said that we want to increase crude production to 4 million barrels per day. We've not even hit 2. The highest we ever done, which was many years ago, was 2.5 million barrels. So imagine we can hit 2.5. Imagine we can hit 4 million. 4 million is like 3 times our current production capacity. That means raising oil revenue by 300%. That's some significant boost to revenue. That helps us to cut our deficit. That helps us to even further provide additional infrastructure. It also, in a way, also helps us to reduce our bills. So I think one easy thing we can actually fix is oil. What that helps to do is that when you generate that revenue, it helps us to invest in other sectors of the economy, which empowers the business, the economic environment to produce the non-oil revenues. Because if you do not have an active economy, you're not going to generate non-oil revenues. So we've got to be able to generate those funds from oil and invest in the economy, which helps us to wrap up and boost our economy, generate those other kinds of revenues that we would like to generate. So I think the starting point is to fix oil, actually, especially because in a couple of decades, oil is not going to be as important as it is today. It can be as worthless as some minerals that nobody goes to tap beneath the ground.
All right, finally, Nojeem, before I let you go, it's a pre-election year and a lot of talks coming from the economic angle or the economic side of the discourse. Now, people are saying that government might shift away, and move to politicking, and there might be no much of developmental efforts by governors, senators, and all. Now, what do you think, and what effect do you think? What could this have on the entire economy? Let's do this in 1-2 minutes.
Okay, so I think that comment is not unusual. It appears to be standard practice that in the months before elections, maybe towards the end of 2022, I mean, if you look at the previous election years, activity seems to nosedive from the government perspective, because people in the National Assembly, many of them are also trying to come back to the National Assembly. Some are trying to contest as governors and what else. So there's a lot of political activities here. Chances are the activity at the National Assembly is going to nosedive. It's going to be as low as possible. And if the National Assembly is not active, it means that laws are not going to be passed as quickly as you want them to be passed. It means that the kind of approvals that the president needs, you're not going to get them quickly. Persons in the executive should also have interest in political positions. So there's a lot of activity here and there, especially towards the last quarter or the second half of the year. So I think what's key for government, is to spend the earlier part of the year to focus a lot more on implementing the large part of the budget, especially as it relates to capex. The kind of approvals that you think you would typically need from the National Assembly, you want to sort them out very, very quickly before you get to the heat of pre-election period. Maybe the first half of the year, pre-election issues won't be as strong as the second half of the year. So I would say that we should do a lot more to administer the economy, to govern the economy in the first half, because in the second half, chances are that government is not going to be able to do a lot. The focus is clearly going to be on elections up until the elections are completed in maybe February next year.
Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory at Deloitte, Mr. Nojeem Yusuf, thank you very much for your time on the show. We appreciate this.
You're welcome.
And it's your first time on the show. We appreciate that too.
Cheers. Thanks, yeah.
All right.
Have a great day.